I've been around Congress a few years, and when I served in the House of Representatives 16 years ago, the Republicans won control of Congress for the first time in 40 years. They promised to change how business was done in Washington, and they elected Newt Gingrich of Georgia as Speaker of the House. On his first day on the job, Speaker Gingrich addressed a black-tie dinner of happy supporters and took aim at an enemy that he said was undermining America's values. That enemy was Big Bird. Newt Gingrich denounced public broadcasting as a sandbox for the rich, and he condemned it for, quote, eating taxpayers' money. He went on to say, they are simply enclaves of the left, using your money to propagandize your children against your values. Once the Gingrich Republican revolutionaries finished passing their so-called contract with America, Gingrich vowed he would do everything in his power to do away with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, National Public Radio, and the public broadcasting stations. Fortunately, in the Republican and Democratic parties, cooler heads prevailed. Big Bird was spared. Well, to borrow a line from former President Reagan, here we go again. When we should be talking about the serious budget deficit affecting America, the House Republican budget spent too much time resurrecting the old bumper stickers of the past. They went to America's bumper sticker museum and said, well, let's see if there's some oldies but goodies here. And they loaded up the Republican budget bill with a lot of old issues. And they went back, and some of them fondly went back to the day when Newt Gingrich went after Big Bird. 16 years after Newt Gingrich, this new band of Republicans in the House are once again denouncing public broadcasting as a hotbed of subversive values, and they vowed to pull the plug. You may remember, Mr. President, our friends across the aisle actually tried to end funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting last November during the lame duck session. That time, their rallying cry was outrage over NPR's firing of commentator Juan Williams. Now there's a new defunding effort underway and a new source of outrage. James O'Keefe, a right-wing activist with a video camera and a conservative agenda, released video last week which he claims proves that National Public Radio is a biased liberal news organization that needs no federal funding. In the video, two allies of Mr. O'Keefe pretend to be members of a Muslim education group who are considering making a large donation, they said, to NPR. Then they secretly recorded their meeting with two NPR executives. Now, if the name James O'Keefe rings a bell with members of the United States Senate, it should. Remember some of the other things that he was caught doing? It was James O'Keefe and his colleagues who posed as telephone repairmen and tried to lie their way into the office of our colleague, Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. They were going to try to make one of their gotcha videos there, but they went too far. In fact, at the end of it, Mr. O'Keefe pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor of entering federal property under false pretenses. Federal judge sentenced Mr. O'Keefe to 3 years of probation, a fine of $1,500, and 100 hours of community service. The same Mr. O'Keefe in 2009 posed with some of his friends as a pimp and prostitute to secretly film a discussion with staffers of the grassroots anti-poverty group ACORN. Their video of that meeting was so inflammatory that Congress vowed to eliminate all federal funding for that group. I cannot tell you, Mr. President, how many amendments we had on the floor of the Senate in the midst of all the problems we were facing in the country and around the world focused on ACORN. 3 separate investigations, incidentally, later cleared ACORN of any wrongdoing. A report by the Congressional Research Service found that Mr. O'Keefe's undercover videotaping may have broken laws both in California and Maryland. Mr. O'Keefe obviously is not too concerned about breaking a law if he thinks he's going to come up with a sensational video. He was convicted in Louisiana, as I mentioned earlier. The New York Daily News, not exactly a liberal news organization, concluded, quote, when it came to the ACORN incident, they'd edited the tape to meet their agenda. As California's then Attorney General Jerry Brown said after they investigated the ACORN video, quote, things are not always as partisan zealots portray them through highly selective editing of reality. Sometimes a fuller truth is found on the cutting room floor. Mr. O'Keefe appears to be engaged in creative editing again, and this time his target is National Public Radio. That's not just my opinion. The website of none other than Fox News' own Glenn Beck, that's right, Glenn Beck, compares the edited and unedited versions of Mr. O'Keefe's latest video and concludes that the edited version appears to be deceptively edited in order to portray statements by one of the secretly recorded NPR execs out of context. An example, on the video, Ron Schiller, who was then in charge of fundraising for NPR and has since been terminated, is heard to say, and I quote, "It's very clear that we would be better off in the long run without federal funding," end of quote. I've heard that repeated over and over again, that this NPR fundraising executive said we'd be better off if we didn't have federal funding. The far right has seized on this statement as proof that NPR doesn't need it and shouldn't get it. Here's the part that ended up on the cutting room floor. Schiller explained, when they look at the full transcript, that, quote, most philanthropists, close quote, think NPR is almost fully funded by the government, which prevents many of them from donating. And he also said that if NPR lost all federal funding now, quote, we'd have a lot of stations go dark. Mr. President, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting supports nearly 1,300 local radio and TV stations in communities all across America, in Illinois, and I'll bet in West Virginia. Direct support for those stations makes up nearly 75 cents out of every dollar they spend. I know, because you turn them on, you listen for the news, and they're begging for money. And you send them a check and think, I hope they'll leave us alone for a little while now. 170 million Americans use public broadcasting services every month. That's more than half of the population of America. In my state of Illinois, 1 million people listen to our 14 public radio stations, and 3 million people rely on our 8 public television stations. All told, funding for public broadcasting works out to about $1.35 per American per year. 11 cents a month? I'd say that's a bargain. It's a fraction of what people would pay to get good information. Eliminating federal funding for Corporation for Public Broadcasting is going to force many smaller stations to close if the House Republicans have their way. The first ones hit, West Virginia, rural areas of Illinois, small town America. They'll be the ones to lose the service first. Rural communities will be really hard hit as they rely more than big stations in big cities on federal funding. Cutting all funding for public broadcasting, does anybody seriously believe that's going to affect the deficit? But it would be a great loss to tens of millions of Americans who rely on public broadcasting for quality entertainment and honest, in-depth news coverage. With the momentous change occurring in the world and the major challenges facing our nation, it's essential that we maintain the integrity and viability of public broadcasting. There's nothing in commercial broadcasting that can replace it. Now, some of our conservative friends, and one of them came up to me on the plane when I was heading home to Chicago this last weekend, say they don't object so much to the content of public broadcasting, they just object philosophically to the whole idea of taxpayers' money being spent to subsidize radio and TV. They say let them go in a free market. If they can survive, fine, and if they can't, so be it. Here's what they ignore. Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, virtually all of the major network stations and other commercial broadcasters receive billions of dollars each year in public subsidies. How? In the form of free use of the public TV spectrum. Mr. President, these stations don't own the airwaves. The American people own the airwaves. And we give them licenses to use our airwaves, America's airwaves, to make their profits. The New America Foundation estimated the total value of the TV spectrum used by commercial TV stations at nearly $5.5 billion a year. And that doesn't count the additional tens of millions of dollars that commercial TV stations make selling political ads every campaign season. Sound familiar? We've all been there, writing checks to these commercial TV stations to put on our ads so we could run for office and preserve the right of that TV station to use the public airwaves free. The public subsidies to commercial stations dwarf what we spend on public broadcasting. Now, I admire the reporting on NPR, but I'm a progressive Democrat. Many conservatives admire that reporting. David Brooks is a conservative I really respect. He writes for the New York Times, and I look forward to his column, even when I disagree with him. I know it's a thoughtful analysis of the challenges we face. Listen to what he said. He said, I think NPR has done a good job over the last 10 years of reducing bias. I thought it was really biased 10 years ago, Brooks says, but now I think it's pretty straight. And the federal money for NPR doesn't so much go for the big stations. It goes so they can go out to the rural parts of America, which wouldn't have those stations otherwise. David Brooks, you're right. And if the Republicans have their way in the House, the losers are going to be a lot of red states and red parts of America who ought to hear both sides of the story, as I believe all Americans should. Tony Blankley, I remember, used to be an aide to then Speaker Gingrich. He works for Fox News and NPR. And he said, and I quote, I've been on NPR regularly for a long time. From a personal perspective, they've always given me plenty of access. I'm clearly a right-wing commentator, Tony Blankley said, so I can't complain. There's a conservative on, then there's a liberal on, so that's all fair. Tony Blankley. He added, no editor or host has ever suggested, could you not be quite so conservative on NPR? I have been open and free to express my opinion. The list goes on. I won't read all of them. I'll put them in the record. But the point I want to make is this, Mr. President. At a time in America when we value our government, when we applaud freedom, when we preach it to the world, when we beg authoritarian regimes to give their people a chance to hear both sides of the story, when we say that our Bill of Rights, when it comes to free speech and free press, should be a guidepost for the world, can we really be in the business of shutting down this opportunity for Americans every single day to hear both sides of the story when it comes to the big issues? I don't think that what was done in the House is about money. I think it's about a political philosophy. Many of them think they just want to shut down NPR because they're offended by some things that are said. Well, let me say from my side of the spectrum, I've been offended the other way. I thought they went too far the other way. But isn't that what it's all about? They give you both sides, make up your own mind. And that's the way it should be. We've seen what can happen when people rush to judgment after seeing selectively edited and sometimes deceptively edited videos. Shirley Sherrod was fired from her job at the Ag Department and painted unfairly as a bigot when she was, in fact, making a passionate plea for racial tolerance. Her comments were knowingly distorted in a video produced by a man who has in the past supported Mr. O'Keefe. Congress voted to cut off federal funding for ACORN before there was any objective investigation into Mr. O'Keefe's damaging video about them. Later investigations showed there was no criminal wrongdoing. Let's not make the same mistake again. Let's not be duped by deceptively edited videos at a time when America needs objective reporting, informative programming that public radio and public television provide.